hello and welcome. This is quite an interesting endgame, and we will skip straight to it. The opening was somewhat interesting, but nothing out of the ordinary. Black got a nice position, and yeah, you decided to kind of play for more than symmetry here, but symmetry is quite good here because black has the bishop pair. So in an open position, black will of course be better as he has this bishop against this knight, and f2 is a perpetual weakness. You mentioned you did not like this position as it seemed that the bishop will be difficult to develop, but it's quite easy to develop. You just take it and develop it, right? And this pawn is not really hanging because b2 is hanging, right? So which would not be very good for white, allowing the rook into b2. So this was one moment, and c5 is a bit more risky. And again, if we have the bishop pair, of course we should try to open up the position, as only then will the bishop pair matter. But okay, knight e4, giving up the bishop pair. Now white has a passed pawn on d5, which is a bit weak, but he shouldn't have just given up so easily. Here queen g6 would have allowed white to continue pushing the pawn, and even though here black might win a pawn on f3 if he wants, this pawn is actually becoming very, very dangerous. So I'm not sure about queen g6. But okay, knight e5, this kind of gives up the exchange for free. And now black is of course winning, and we should be able to win this position. So firstly, when we have a huge material advantage, the first step is always to consolidate and not allow counterplay, right? Because the material advantage is a static feature, right? It will not go away into the air, right? It will not be gone if nothing happens, which means that we have to make sure that nothing happens. Nothing bad to our position happens, that is. So what could go wrong? Well, the d pawn could promote, or something bad could happen on f7. This is more or less what could happen, plus simple tactics. And in this case, you lost to a simple tactic. Well, not lost, but lost in exchange. So rook d8 happened. I guess this is a bit simpler because it attacks the knight, and if we are able to improve our pieces with tempo, we should usually be trying to do that as much as possible. If he plays f4, now we can improve the other rook, and if d6, the big point is c4, giving up the pawn, but exchanging pieces and getting the pawn back on f4. But all of this is not necessary for calculation. It's enough to understand that in this position, the d6 pawn will not really survive, and the bishop, even if the pawn goes to d7, the bishop cannot hold this pawn from any of these diagonals, because black will always have the option of blocking it like this or like this. So black is going to be up a rook for a bishop, and the rooks will also probably be exchanged. So always try to look for the simplest solutions. Okay, rook a d8, now d6, and knight c, the tactical blunder, but not really because of what the opponent played. Knight g6 allows black to go to a technically winning endgame, but move d7 would have been, of course, a lot more annoying because of the same move here, probably knight g6, though here I guess c4 happens. So probably the problem is that white is able to defend the pawn. This is not entirely obvious because after f6 it seems that the pawn might drop, but now surprisingly this check is quite annoying, and black will not have time to take the pawn on d7, which means it will survive. And with passed pawns, the further they go, the more powerful they become, of course. So this was kind of bad. Okay, knight g6 is also something we shouldn't have blundered. So how do we win this position? Well, firstly, again, avoid tricks, right? Currently, white is not really threatening anything, right? I guess his threat might be d7, but it's usually connected to knight g6 or knight f7 at some point. So we should probably get this rook in the game. And the way to get this rook in the game is to not lose f7. To not lose f7, we must move the king out of the way. Something like g5 comes to mind. And white doesn't really have a way to make progress. Let's say he skips a move. We play king g7, next move will be f6. Then the rook will go here, and then slowly we will pick up this pawn, or with c4 as well. The engine suggests c4, which is kind of a practical solution as well, giving up the pawn kind of for free. But now after rook f8, even if white gets the pawn to d7, then again it will not stay there forever, because the white bishop cannot block, cannot defend forever on these two diagonals. Cannot even really get to this diagonal, and on this one it will always get kicked away. So simplification is one way to win with a material advantage. Rook e98, and now we get this endgame by force, and this endgame is a technical win for black, because he has a pawn advantage and there are pawns on both sides, which means that white will ideally not be able to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, getting a knight against king endgame. So in this endgame, the way you played it, you violated quite a bit of principles. Firstly, you exchanged a lot of pawns, and generally the defending side should be the one exchanging pawns, because the less pawns are on the board, the less weaknesses he has to worry about, and the closer he gets to theoretical endgames, such as knight against king or similar endgames. So first you decide to play b5, which objectively these moves are fine. Probably best would be to bring the king as soon as possible, as the king should always go first. And the pawn majority will not kind of cease to exist as well. It will always be there. So it's best to start pushing when the time is right. And of course, the general plan for black should be to queen the c pawn. So of course we will have to play b5, c4, b4, c3 at some point as well. Okay, b5, king e7, king f6, and the king gets to a very nice square on e5. So a4 was not very accurate. Now the bishop has to move, and here you made the first mistake. Here again we have to remember what the point is of our play, right? And our point is to create a passed pawn. So how do we create a passed pawn? Well, we could go a6 and allow him to exchange and then try to create a c passed pawn, but we could just play b4, and this would eventually also create a passed pawn by playing c4. For example, after b3, a5. Now we will have to maneuver quite a bit, probably improve the position on the king side, and then eventually probably put the knight on e5. This would be ideal, and then try to exchange. Another idea for black is to just give up the pawn at some point to put the knight on c5. Now that is a bit more complicated. So b4 was one idea, and the point is that we're saving more pawns on the board. The more pawns are on the board, the more weaknesses he will have. So for example, if we make the c4 move work at some point, a4 will also be a weakness. And we need two weaknesses to win a game. Probably simplest was to just take, to at least imbalance the pawn structure a little bit. And after this we can play c4 at this point and advance a little bit. And after king c3, even though white can exchange more pawns, then finally we will have a passed pawn on the a file. Also the knight is quite tricky. It can win the pawns on the king side. Okay, a6, takes, and b3, and you played c4. And yeah, as you mentioned, this makes it a bit too easy for white. And again, similar to before, we can see that this move c4 is not going away. We can always make the move c4. So with such committal decisions that we cannot go back from, we should make them at the best possible moment. When is the best possible moment? When all the pieces are in best positions. Is the king in the best position? I don't know. I would rather it be on b4, for example. It looks quite far away, but let's imagine the black king goes like this. What exactly is white going to do in the meantime, right? This knight and pawns are dominating all the squares. If white starts pushing, then he will have weaknesses. Otherwise, there's not that much for white to do. So that's with the king, but otherwise we can always improve the pawn structure on the king side, as this is definitely not the ideal pawn structure. we can play g5, which makes sense, to not allow h4, for example. The move h4 would have the idea that if black starts advancing, then more pawns will get exchanged. And this is again something we would like to avoid. And white would like to put his pawns on dark squares to complement the light squared bishop. So g5 makes sense. The next moves could be h5, h4. And at some point we might try to provoke some weaknesses. Maybe try to get the knight to h4 or to e4. For example, f5, knight e4 is a possibility. For example, let's see, this it happens. We could play something like f5, and if king e3, we can play g4. Now we introduce a new idea of putting the knight on f3, and the white will always have to think about the pawn endgames, which are usually lost for him because of the further distant passed pawn. Right. So instead, you played c4, which basically violates the principle of do not hurry. Right. We must not hurry in endgames, and before making the idea that we want to make, let's make sure that we do it at the best appropriate moment. So improve the position to the maximum while you still can. So now this is objectively still fine, but a lot of pawns have been traded. Now you decide to start pushing, and you start kind of with the wrong pawn, because he could play h4, and again the problem here is if you want to continue pushing, you will be forced to exchange more pawns. And the more pawns get off the board, the higher the likelihood of the scenario of him just giving up the bishop. So bishop a8, and now f4. So you're pushing the pawns on dark squares, but after bishop f3, now it will be quite difficult to push the other pawns, which is why we probably should have advanced more slowly on the light squares. And here, surprisingly, the only move for white is the move f3. The reason being that knight e4 was a threat. For example, if he goes somewhere here, knight e4, and this endgame is winning for black because his king is a lot better, and it can get even more improved in a few moments. Also, black is probably going to get some kind of weaknesses to attack over here. For example, after knight g4, h3, the king could go to g3, and black is generally winning. And of course, the pawn endgame is also lost, as the king is quite more advanced. Though this is a bit more difficult, h4 should be played. Maybe it's not even a win, but it's quite practical for white. For example, now the threat is h3, or g5, g4, and then h3, getting to the f3 square. Maybe this is not really winning, but it does seem that way. Okay, f4 and the g3. And this allows kind of another scenario of black winning on the king side with knight e4, and this shouldn't really be missed, right? Here, of course, you cannot take, and after this, knight f2, the threat is to take and go here, which would win the pawn on g3, leaving black with two connected passed pawns and also the better king. There's not much white can do about this. He can take, but clearly this pawn will be lost, and black has two connected passed pawns, which will be enough to win. So instead g5, now more pawns will be traded, and here there's not that many pawns left, so white is already on the verge of drawing, but black still has a winning idea, which is to win on the king side. After all, there are some weaknesses here, so we must try to exploit them. And yes, you mentioned king f5, you mentioned you had absolutely no idea, but after all, what else are you going to do? Right, so you played knight e4, which makes sense, but at this point you will not have two connected passed pawns, and here white is already close to drawing because now you cannot access anything with your king, as the f4 pawn is blocking your king. So now there's only 2 against 1 pawn, so if one pawn exchange happens, white will sacrifice the bishop, and it will be game over. Right? And most importantly, your king cannot access it at any point. So here the last moment was for the king to go here, threatening king g4, which is easy enough. So if here, then king g4 and f3, king h4, this is quite simple. But this is kind of more interesting. Importantly, the pawn is going. So the knight is doing very well defending the pawn from the back. Here clearly black will take it here, and he will probably even have time to regroup with the king. If white tries to stop this, then black just goes like this anyway, and the pawn on f3 allows the king to go to g3 and also blocks the bishop. So this should have been kind of found, because knight e4 already is a draw because of the small amount of pawns, because now you've traded another pair of pawns. And after knight h3, practically this is still difficult for white, but it seems he found a way to draw. Importantly here, he cannot allow king g4, and this is black's only kind of idea. And yeah, here he made a draw. And I mean, the knight is kind of badly placed, so you can't really do anything at this point. So that's quite unfortunate as well. So generally, when you're playing for a win in an endgame with a pawn advantage, try not to exchange pawns. Right? This is one thing, because it seems you did not avoid pawn exchanges, and before executing the breaks that you want to execute, improve the position to the maximum, as the break is not going anywhere anyway. So hopefully this was useful, and good luck next time.